Namaskar. Welcome to this Social Science Baha lecture series. You have the number there, and Nepal Water Conservation Foundation, Pani Satsang number 1770. What we do is we try to lob interesting people who come here. Ian has been here on a trekking trip with friends, so we lobbed him and to try to share words of wisdom. This is what we try to do. I won't get into a long description of Ian. You already have in the list here. But I'd like to tell you that I've been with STEPS Center since Laila Mehta there, Professor Laila Mehta roped me in, and I was on the STEPS advisory board, of which Ian is the boss. Interesting is, Sussex has two very important, institutions. One is the STEPS Center, and the other is SPRU, the Science Policy Study Unit. Very interesting work they're doing. STEPS was there to look at this, re-examine this whole idea of sustainability in food, water, a whole range of issues. And in the process, in these last, I think since 2006 is when it was set up, the last 18 years or so, it has managed to do a lot of the, they're questioning all kinds of things, including, what I was involved with some of the scholars there, Jeremy Alush and Chulalongkorn professor there, Carl Middleton. We brought out this book on Nexus, the Nexus approach on food, water and energy. But we did it from a perspective which is generally not found, and it's only in STEPS that we can explore these crazy angles, which was not looking at this again from a very technocratic manner, but looking at it, water, energy, food nexus of politics and justice. Is it meeting those ends? So Idea Sussex also had another project whose closing is today. When we are, at the end of this talk, they begin over there, so we won't make it 2 hours. It's the Strings project, which also looks at, the whole sustainability thing and the SDGs and all that. So this is what Sussex is. It's a hotbed of ideas, and we're very happy to have Ian today with us to share it. He and Andy Sterling brought out this book on uncertainty. And if one thing characterizes this age right now we're in the middle of is uncertainty. In economics, in international affairs, in international relations, in finance, you name it, uncertainty is, going through the roof, so to speak. So that book is all about it. There is in the flyer that we had, the link is there. It's open access, and you can download the entire book. So without much ado, I'm going to give the mic to Ian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deepak, and thank you for this invitation. It's a great honour to present in this series. So in this talk, which I think will last about 40 minutes, and you'll have to shut me up if I go on, because we want to have good discussion afterwards, I want to make a very basic argument that if we put uncertainty at the centre of thinking and practice, this means a fundamental rethinking of development as we know it. And I'll show, for a variety of reasons, we're still stuck in a very linear, mechanistic, technocratic mode, sometimes with extras added on, but very often not. And this fails to address this dynamic complexity of today's turbulent world that Deepak mentioned. So this mismatch, I argue, is problematic and actually sometimes dangerous. So my focus is on uncertainty, as I've said, the unpredictable unknowns that confront us. Helga Novotny described in her book, such uncertainties are written into the script of life, whether this is in respect of climate change, finance systems, critical infrastructures, migration flows, epidemic disease outbreaks. Uncertainties continuously undermine the neat and simple ways policies and institutions are designed. But what if the world we live in has so fundamentally changed, the institutions, policies and educational systems indeed, and all our day-to-day approaches to living are no longer fit for purpose? What if we have experienced, or maybe about to experience through climate change, a radical shift in environments, economies, political systems? What if the world is dominated by uncertainty and complexity, not just predictable risk and stability? What if approaches we're taught that good development, planning, risk management, control systems and so on, just no longer work? So I'm going to argue that this actually is the case, and we're experiencing what Bauman and others have called liquid modernity. And this means we have to radically rethink development theory and indeed practice. But I'm also going to argue that not all is lost, that there are some people who have very long grappled with uncertainty that we can all learn from. These are the reliability professionals that I'll talk about, who by necessity must operate across domains in real time. And this includes pastoralists, livestock keepers across the world who live with and from uncertainty, often operating hidden from view and living at the margins. And this, I think, means a very different approach to development. So that in sum is my argument. Let's move to some definitions. What do we mean by uncertainty? Or drawing on the work of my colleague at SPRU that Deepak also mentioned, also co-director of the STEP Centre, Andy Sterling, the more encompassing term incertitude. We can identify 4 dimensions, and let me illustrate this with an example from a pastoral area, this time in northern Kenya. First we have risk. Now, risk is where the probabilities of both outcomes and their likelihoods are known, or at least deemed unproblematic. This is what one might call the classic engineering approach. For example, when we build a road, we can use risk parameters to assess the dangers of that, or a bridge, or any of these sort of classic engineering approaches. Risk management is central. But importantly, risk is contrasted with uncertainty, where likelihoods are unknown, such as in the case of drought. Despite improvements in climate forecasting and all the rest of it, we don't know when or where droughts, or indeed floods, will strike, and with what impacts. Rarely talked about is the form of uncertainty arising around ambiguities, where outcomes are contested. For example, taking this pastoral area, we could have the pastoral area could be somewhere we produce outputs from camels, or from tourism and wildlife conservation, or from infrastructure development. And in Isiolo, for example, in northern Kenya, all of these are competing. So there's ambiguities about outcomes, even if we know something about the likelihoods of each. And this is where questions of fairness, of justice, of distribution, who wins, who loses, come to the centre in our debates about incertitude. And finally, we have the condition of ignorance, where, oops, didn't mean to do that, where we don't know what we don't know. And that's the bottom right-hand corner of the diagram, where we really don't know what we don't know. In Donald Rumsfeld's words, those conditions that surprise us from nowhere. Now, in conventional approaches to development, policies, institutions, and practices, they tend to close down around risk, the top left-hand corner. This is where we assume, not always correctly, that we know about likelihoods and we know about outcomes. And this is conditioned by power, politics, institutions, what Michel Foucault called governmentalities. So we often get stuck in that top left-hand corner. And the examples from pastoral development I put on this slide, we could apply to water development or housing or anything. You could choose any area in development you work on. Plans, models, insurance products, goals, targets, metrics, indicators, all seek closure, pushing us into zones where knowledge and outcomes are assumed to be known, or at least thought to be controllable through estimation, prediction, calculation. So in the area of rural development, for example, there's much excitement these days in dryland areas where I work, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, around climate adaptation approaches that use new technologies to anticipate and predict the impact of droughts, for example, and therefore insurance products that protect against that likelihood through index-linked insurance products. And by definition, insurance products define outcomes in terms of predicted probabilities. But when you don't know what those probabilities are, you're in trouble. And that's why a lot of these interventions in these areas unravel. Despite all this money pumped in by the donors and others with all their fancy satellites and models and whatnot, they do unravel and sometimes actually increase vulnerability rather than reduce it. So, where do all these professional practices and styles that push us towards risk and control and stability and management come from? Are they always necessary? Are there other systems of thought that offer a different perspective? I argue that we need to dig a lot deeper in order to gain a more historical perspective into how framings of development have emerged, particularly in the West, but also elsewhere. And let me move to that now. So many see the project of so-called development starting with Harry Truman's speech of 1945. Problematic, I think, that history is. Development was this big, state-led, normative aspiration for change after World War II. It was about planning and reconstruction and the development of stability after a world war. It, of course, took a neoliberal turn later on through the Washington Consensus as the focus shifted from states to markets delivering progress. But it was still firmly a modernising vision, where the objective was a particular vision of planned progress, overcoming risks, controlling the unruly. But as Cowan and Shenton many years ago, in a book called Doctrines of Development, suggested, we actually need to dig a bit deeper into the histories of where these ideas came from. So in the West, in the 18th and 19th century, there was much debate on what so-called development or modernity or progress was. For example, in the early 1800s, Auguste Comte's ideas were rooted in an understanding of cycles of change, familiar to people living in this part of the world, growth and destruction, ideas of collective trusteeship. It was only later, in the 1800s and early 1900s, coinciding with Darwinism, and the sort of ideas of linear progress and evolution, a particular version of evolution associated with the Industrial Revolution in Northern Europe, that a linear, individualized idea of progress evolved to a particular version of modernity. But this canon of thought, of course, influenced what became development studies, problematically in my view. For example, through Rostow's idea of stages of development, and the idea that there was something that was developed and something that was underdeveloped, and all you had to do is go from one to the other. This, as I think anyone in this room will agree, is a problematic framing, but it's still live and well. And these sort of ideas of modernity being associated with a particular version of evolution have framed our views of development ever since. The result is blueprint plans, control, management of risk, all of that stuff that I was talking about. This comes from a historically embedded intellectual set of ideas that have framed what we call so-called development. And it's reiterated through education, development projects, and all the rest of it. But this framing for development needn't be so. As I've already argued, there are other older traditions in Western thought, such as Auguste Comte's that I mentioned, but many others. But more importantly, this framing of development, which is very much part of the colonial project, of course, too, is confronted and challenged by other ideas, whether from this part of the world, or Africa, or Latin America, where ideas of cyclicity, renewal, impermanence, and yes, uncertainty are very much part of philosophical ideas and forms of thinking. But given the dominance of these Western framings that I've talked about, too often these are subdued, eliminated through colonial impositions and indeed the post-colonial project of development. But as the world grapples with unprecedented turbulence and diverse uncertainties, it's important to seek out, I think, alternative inspirations from different sources that can be actively resurfaced and reclaimed. And this is why I think we have to look to other traditions of thought more broadly. But that's not to say that even within sort of conventional Western thought, the ideas of uncertainty haven't been there. These are 3 quotes, which I won't read out, from Nobel Prize-winning scientists and economists, writing significantly 50 to 100 years ago. Unfortunately today, these ideas that were part and parcel of economics and science often have been squashed too by this technocratic planning vision of development. Particularly from the 1960s, as disciplines narrowed, such perspectives where uncertainty was very central, including in economics, have been lost, and in research as well as in teaching. Look at any standard textbook on economics and development, for example, and there's barely any mention of uncertainty as a concept. No admission that calculative practices, models, standard formulaic plans cannot necessarily, and they can contribute and help, but they cannot necessarily solve complex, uncertain challenges. But we are confronted by complex, uncertain challenges. That's what development's about. And it's, of course, a large reason why this mismatch, why development often fails. People worry, why does it fail? Well, there's a fairly basic argument. There's a mismatch of framings. But across fields, despite the mainstream views that I've outlined, I think there's a beginning to be a realization that this mismatch matters. And there's a bubbling up of alternative perspectives that often come from practice, often by necessity as people confront uncertain conditions in the real world and realize that things don't always work as planned. And I want to give 3 very short examples to illustrate this. The first comes from finance and banking. So the 2008-9 financial crash provoked some important reflections, I think, because here was a situation where the financial system in the West particularly fell apart. It didn't work like the textbooks suggested. And there have been a number of very nice reflections on this, including some of those indicated in the books on the right-hand side of this slide. The former chief economist of the Bank of England, a guy called Andy Haldane, reflected at the time on why the conventional approach, highlighted in the middle column at the top there, didn't work. In a really nice paper called Rethinking the Financial Network, he argued, processes of securitization resulted in the network becoming complex, dense, and opaque, with diversification generating heightened system-wide uncertainty. The result, he said, was the crash. The crisis was rooted in what he called an exaggerated sense of knowledge and control in the banking and finance system. And he and others argued that a very different type of financial regulation is required that increased transparency, collective accountability, and focused on the cultures and practices of real people in market settings. Basic conclusion is that markets, and so banking and finance, are constructed through social relations. These matter, even when transactions occurring in nanoseconds across computers globally. Does this appear in the economics textbooks? No. By and large, no. Is this central to the manuals for good practice for banking? Almost certainly not. But it needs to be. And such insights, I think, are important as we reflect on how uncertain conditions in different settings affect new practices. My second example is from so-called critical infrastructures, the supply of energy and water supply systems, a thing that Deepak knows a lot about. How to generate reliable supplies of key services, despite uncertainties or variabilities in inputs. Again, we see two broad responses. One, the standard control-orientated engineering approach in the middle there, based very much on technical managerial approaches. Remember that diagram, closing down to risk in the top left-hand corner? That's the standard approach. But the second is what Emery Rowe and colleagues call a mess and reliability approach. This is very different. Emery and colleagues observed professionals in California in particular dealing with electricity supply, keeping the lights on. Where failure is unacceptable, reliability is generated through the proactive intervention of lots of individuals in networks, tracking between the micro and the macro, navigating away from zones of ignorance and danger, but managing uncertainty in real time. And this is actually what a lot of people do in complex systems, but they're often not recognized. These are the scientists, the engineers, the IT professionals, the suppliers, the regulators and others. Together they keep the system running, often through quite informal interactions. And many of these responses go unacknowledged. They're informal, they're below the radar, they're practices that are tacit, they're experiential knowledges. They rely on case studies rather than models, scenario analyses rather than predictions, pattern recognition, and so on. We know these people, many of you probably are these people. And this is the professionalism, not control-based engineering, that makes the system reliable. And I think this idea of reliability professionals is an important one, and I'll come back to it. My third example is addressing infectious diseases, disease outbreaks. Ebola, COVID-19, and so on are good examples. Of course, simplifying, again, there are two very contrasting perspectives. The conventional approach focused on risk management, using predictive models to generate early warning systems, medicalized, securitized responses following, often fails. Yet the experience of COVID-19 through the pandemic and the Ebola outbreak in West Africa in 2016 and thereabouts, and the avian influenza outbreaks in Southeast Asia before, show that these top-down risk-based approaches just don't work. If responses don't deal with uncertainties at play, the social relations, the cultural logics, the community interactions at the centre of a disease outbreak, then they fail, as they did tragically in the UK, but also elsewhere. It was Paul Richards, who is an anthropologist, who reflected on the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. He observed common sense, improvisation, distributed practical knowledge, and collective action are invaluable elements in a people's science of infection control. In other words, dealing with uncertainty in real time as reliability professionals. And this is just an important argument yet again that the predictive top left-hand corner risk and managerial and control-based approach doesn't necessarily work. There were millions of COVID-19 models, none of them were realized in practice. In practice, it was people on the ground that managed the outbreak, whether in the UK and I'm sure the same in Nepal. So these three cases, I could add many more, you could add many more, show the limits of a risk-based, control-orientated approach. I hope I've given that argument clearly enough. And in the book that Deepak mentioned, which is open access, you can download it, we reflected on uncertainty from multiple different angles, including these three, but also others in relation to migration and insurance and city development and many more. And we identified 5 different ways of thinking about uncertainty. Through people's indeterminate knowledge, through the material properties of systems, through people's own experiences, through their feelings and emotions, through how uncertainties impinge on people's bodily experience, and through day-to-day practices. And in the different chapters we explore how these different forms of uncertainty interact. So, if we're to deal with uncertainty as a central phenomenon of today's world, who do we learn from in order to become better at dealing with these uncertain, turbulent conditions? So the radical argument that I want to offer you now is that actually we need to go to the margins, to people who live with and from uncertainty on a daily basis. And in the case of the work that I do, these are pastoralists, livestock keepers who manage rangelands and livestock in highly variable conditions, whether this is yak herders in the Langtang Valley or in this case camel herders in northern Kenya. And I want to argue that these people are very similar to those reliability professionals we saw in the control rooms, the bankers dealing with the crash, and the frontline health professionals. There are very similar practices, very similar approaches that are necessary. And I think a lot of the learning that we can do comes from people like that. So I want to make a connection between people in pastoral areas, we could choose other places where uncertainties are dealt with, and those who work in financial derivatives, air traffic control, hurricane disasters, pandemic responses, and so on. And making these connections has been central to the project that I currently lead called Pastres, which I'm going to now mention. And I want to share some of our emerging thinking with you, just as a hint as to where we might go into the future and what lessons we can learn from the margins. So, our project is based in different parts around the world. It's funded by the European Union. We work in under Tibet, in China, in Gujarat, in Western India, in Borana in southern Ethiopia, in Isiolo in Kenya, which I've already mentioned, in southern Tunisia, and in Sardinia in Italy. Very different settings. But across those very different settings, what's common is that livestock keepers are confronted by highly variable ecological, environmental, political, and other conditions. And they have been learning over millennia, in many cases, to manage those uncertainties in interesting ways. And I just want to give you a few little vignettes, if you like, of how we are beginning to think about uncertainty. So, as I said, pastoralism is centrally about living with and from uncertainty, making use of variability as a productive resource. Contrast this, as in this slide, with the Green Revolution model of agriculture: fixed, stable, controlled, so often promoted as the standard trajectory of development in agriculture. But pastoralists must make use of extensive rangelands, which make up actually over half the world's land surface. And as I was learning in Isimod, in this region, 60% of the land surface. Very significant areas. And they exist in every continent outside Antarctica. And those rangelands are highly variable. They're so-called non-equilibrial resources. And it's a production system where variability is valued, not ignored or controlled, as in conventional mainstream agricultural development. So living with and from uncertainty has other consequences too, with major implications. So let me explain with a few examples. So first, in relation to markets, we talked about markets in relation to finance, but markets in relation to pastoralists. Our work in Sardinia, in Italy, looked at the production of milk from sheep and the production of the famous Pecorino Romano cheese. Now, the way markets operate in these settings don't exist in the standard economic textbook forms. They're part of networks, they're part of social cultural relations, they're nested, they're informal markets. It's all happening in what one might call real markets, where uncertainty is very central, not like the economics textbooks. And all pastoralists have to negotiate this all the time, just as with the bankers in the financial markets we discussed earlier. These are social, political, embedded relations that make up markets. So responding to uncertainty requires us to think much more a sophisticated way about market development, not just linear value chains of demand and supply, but of price setting and so on, but about these social relations at the centre of market development. In relation to land and natural resources, colleagues in Tibet, across the border, looked at land control arrangements. And they found, not surprisingly, just as it is in Nepal, I'm sure, that the standard models of private, common, state property are much more flexible than is assumed. Necessarily, because of uncertainty, big snowfall, late monsoon, whatever, they have to be flexible. They have to assemble hybrid arrangements of land and resources all the time. They must confront diverse uncertainties, whether those are variable climatic conditions affected through climate change, or land grabs, or investments, and so on, by external actors. So reliability in the face of uncertainty, just as with the critical infrastructures discussed before, has to be generated through reliability professionals engaged in social relations with investment in institutions. This requires shared knowledge of system change as well as rapid real-time response to immediate conditions. So this herder in Tibet has to do that all the time. And land governance and land tenure emerges out of that sort of setting. Standard models won't do. In East Africa, our colleagues have been looking at how pastoralists have been responding to livelihood shocks, especially drought, but often combined with things like conflict, locust swarms, COVID, and so on, often in combination. Do the standardized approach to livestock insurance and social protection work? No, they don't, because risks are much more complex than is assumed by those bureaucratic designs, because they are, in essence, uncertain. So a wider perspective that links how people respond in real time to these shocks and stresses gets us to understanding how, not just through a technical intervention, but through a social and technical intervention, we can deal with shocks and stresses. And often this is what happens through what is called moral economics. Social relations of care and collectivity are always central, not only in these East African pastoralist systems, but also elsewhere. And finally, and not surprisingly, when talking about pastoralism, mobility is absolutely important. And looking at pastoralism in Western India, in Gujarat, amongst the Rabari pastoralists, we see how pastoralists must seek out resources across a very diverse landscape. But movement isn't just a movement from point A to point B. It's an informed scanning of horizons and development of relations, often with farmers, in order to gain access to resources. And that's also part of this social and political negotiation. So in our increasingly mobile and globalized world, mobility is important for everybody. And learning from pastoralists how they manage mobilities is really important. Which is why then linking pastoral mobilities to migration is important, because very often in these pastoral areas, remittance income and so on, and connections to outside is essential to livelihoods. But being mobile is really important to sustain the relationships and the diverse institutions that exist in these pastoral institutions, in these pastoral settings, in this case, in southern Tunisia. So rather than fixity and stability, liquid, mobile relations dominate. So-called development can happen in just one place. People are between different places. And very often the standard interventions by states that block mobilities, visa processes, border controls, refugee flows, and borders overall, can undermine livelihoods and people's abilities to confront sustainability. So, across our case studies, and I've just given you some hints, we see very diverse perspectives on how we think about uncertainty and how pastoralists think about uncertainty. And our argument is, well, if we learn from pastoralists, maybe this can help us in other areas. So, whether that's around market development, service delivery, disaster and emergency responses, social protection, livelihood and resilience development, natural resource management, and so on, all of these have to take uncertainty centrally. And that's why pastoralists are actually very simple, similar to the trading floor bankers, the control room operators, the frontline health workers, and so on, that we talked about earlier. It doesn't take too much of a leap of imagination to see the connections once you begin to think that uncertainty is central, and that then this means rejecting a control-orientated managerial approach. So, where does this leave us in thinking about development? Now, this isn't a new argument. Uncertainty on the Himalayan scale was originally published in 86. And here are a bunch of other books that make arguments that non-Western thinking, narrow visions of modernity and progress, and contingency, conjuncture, uncertainty are all central to thinking. This isn't a new argument, but it's one I think that needs to find its way into mainstream thinking, and particularly mainstream training and education of new generations of people, because we are going to be confronting more uncertainties into the future as the world becomes more complex, more connected, and climate change begins to make that even more challenging for managing our lives. So to conclude, and simplifying hugely, in the SEB Centre that Deepak mentioned right at the beginning, we've contrasted rather simplistically, but just for the purposes of argument, between two approaches to development, if you like. One which could be called controlling transitions. These are managed, expert-led, top-down, and this generates, as we've discussed, a particular version of modernist progress and around controlling and predicting risk. The top left-hand corner, if you remember, of the original diagram, and doesn't address the wider issues of incertitude. And this is contrasted with what we call caring transformations, and here uncertainty and indeed ambiguity and ignorance are much more central. It's a more political, it's a more contested, it's a more unruly process of hybridity, of bricolage, of making do, and it requires multiple plural knowledges and skills to make it happen. Diversity, flexibility, experiment, improvisation, they're all the watchwords that are central. And such a perspective doesn't rely on fear and force. It's a more hopeful vision for development, where principles of care, conviviality, collectivity, commoning, and so on are more central. In other words, it's not mainstream development as we know it. But it actually, of course, draws on a lot of alternative intellectual traditions that I've mentioned before. It's not as if this is new, but it does require, in the current language, decolonizing our thinking, reframing our thinking, and constructing a different vision of development where uncertainty and variability are at the core. So, to end, uncertainty is central to most people's lives. I'm sure all of us who've been through the pandemic, there's a war in Europe, the British government is collapsing, there's all sorts of uncertainties in the world which we confront on a daily basis. Some years ago, a Tibetan herder from the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau in China, where this picture was taken, explained to me what he thought uncertainty was. The past is gone, the present is happening, but you can't know the future. That is uncertainty. So that herder is a reliability of professional. That herder must deal with the present and deal with uncertainty and embrace it as central. Not something to be wished away, not necessarily something to be modelled, although modelling can help, but a rather more humble, a more hopeful perspective, and one that suggests a different vision of modernity and progress. So when we think about how to teach development, how we reflect on this in our educational programs, we may have to challenge some of the assumptions that exist in standard courses, and this is a challenge in my institution as elsewhere. Because too many of us, from the beginning of our education, have been trained in that almost 19th century Victorian version of evolutionist linear development, and that's the way we have been brought up to think. That's the way we've been schooled. But I think that has to be challenged, rethought, and a different vision for development has to be invented, which I hope can be a collective exercise, and the conversations with Deepak over the years have enriched that in many, many ways. So I'm going to end there and leave you with a few websites.
Great, thank you. As usual, you put more questions in my head. Let me just mention some of the thoughts that popped up in my head before I open the floor. You start with your Tsinghua pastoralist, mentioning that present is the only thing that counts because the past is dead and the future is not born yet, okay, and never will be. Okay. One of the interesting things that people ask about the practice of Hinduism in Nepal or India is we have this triumvirate, like most other religions do also, the Trinity, Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh. Now, interestingly, in Southeast Asia, Brahma is, you find temples. In Bangkok, in the middle of Bangkok, you have a nice Brahma temple. In South Asia, it's very rare to find a Brahma temple. Very rare. There's one in Pushkar, there is one in Patan over here, but you really don't. Shiva temples and Vishnu temples just abound. Why is that? Because Brahma is not really worshipped as such. Okay? And the legend or the mythical part of it is that Brahma, at one point there was a competition between Vishnu and Brahma to find out where the beginning and end of Shiva was. Vishnu came back and said, I couldn't find it, but Brahma apparently lied and said he found it. So he was cursed by Shiva to say that he would never be worshipped. Okay. Now that's the mythical part. The philosophical part of it is even more interesting, and it comes from Sankhya and Vedanta philosophies. It is that Brahma represents creation, which is the past. It's gone. You don't need to worry about it. You need to know about it, but not worry about it.
Right.
Vishnu represents the present, everything going on right now. And you really have to worship Vishnu because if you want your present to be nice. Okay? Whereas Shiva represents the future. And that's something you really better worry about because it depends where you're going to end up. Okay. So, in a sense, that's exactly the summary of your Tsinghua pastoralist.
Yeah.
And that's where you mentioned that you have to come to other sources or traditions of knowledge. And there are some very powerful, these kinds of traditions when we go out of the more linear Descartesian, or what you might call it, Western rationalism that is underpinned much of development, as you say, since the days of Harry Truman. Okay, so there needs to be rethought. Now, what is interesting, the book that Ian mentioned, Uncertainty in the Himalayan Scale, Michael Thompson, Michael Warburton, and Tom Hatley. This was brought out in 1986, and it was also part of this Mohonk conference in upstate New York, where, interestingly, it was interesting for me also to be on the front line there to observe the front benches. The whole theory of Himalayan degradation was scientifically debunked by a lot of watershed scientists from all around the world. And the idea was that till then was, oh, the fecund Himalayan, poor Himalayan farmers are breeding like rabbits, they're going uphill, cutting trees and in fragile landscape, creating more landslides and causing floods in Bangladesh. But it turned out that it's extremely simplistic and simply not true. Farmers in the hills, if they don't have land or their land can't support them, don't go uphill where there's nothing but ice and snow. They go downhill to the plains of Punjab and India and Bombay and now to the Gulf. Okay? So this narratives that dominate, I'm getting more and more worried about climate change. It's real. We are some of the first Nepalis to study climate change here. It's real, but the trouble is it's like the theory of Himalayan degradation. It is somehow, I feel, being misused, shall I say, to hide maldevelopment. Yeah. Much of the worries that we are having here is because of our maldevelopment, bad development that's causing all the problems. But then it's easy to just say, oh, it's because of climate change. My buffalo didn't give milk this morning, it is climate change. No, damn it, you didn't give it milk, you didn't give it grass, you didn't do a lot of other things. Okay. So somewhere I think we've got to find a more sane response to development, and development agencies are failing massively right now because it is now everything and climate change. Education and climate change, I don't know, highway building and climate change, house painting and climate change, name it, okay? So tagging climate change forcibly into everything might probably lead to a similar kind of maldevelopment in thinking that will probably get us on the wrong side of things. So what also struck me as I'm sure lots of you have questions popping up and I'll open the floor to you. But as I was wondering about your pastoralists actually managing mobility and uncertainty at the same time, I was wondering how this, I wish younger scholars in Nepal would pick this up. How, Nepali migrants, it's all about mobility. It used to be just to the plains of India or, cities of India or Kathmandu when life in the hills became untenable. Now it's across the globe, Malaysia, South Korea, Gulf, UK, you name it. Nepalis are everywhere. I was surprised when I was in Berkeley that, there were only 2 or 3 Nepali families there in '86. I went there, I don't know, is it 2010 or something like that, 9 or 10. There are at least 126 Nepali taxi drivers in Berkeley. Forget the others who are there. So this kind of mobility is there. Now, how does this whole pastoralist uncertainty thing tie into this Nepali migrant story? How are they managing uncertainty? I think it's a fertile field for several PhDs right now, I think. I don't know how the younger scholars will do it. So, it's just some of the thoughts that popped into my head. I'm sure more thoughts have popped into your head. So I'll open the floor. We'll take 3 questions, get Ian to respond, then go for a second cycle and so on. See how far we go. Yes. Comments, questions? Yes. Navin Dahal, who is current chair of Nepal Water Conservation Foundation. And he's a meteorologist, climate scientist. I'm sure he's upset by what I just said. His PhD work is on biochar. Since I know he's so well, I introduce you. The rest will have to introduce themselves.
Okay, thank you very much for this wonderful, and actually after this pandemic, before this pandemic, we used to have this kind of very dialogue, but now we're missing. But and your presence and it's a great revival of that series of dialogue, discussion, academic activity. And myself from, as you mentioned, from meteorology, hydrology, water management system, currently chairing the Nepal Water Conservation Foundation. Just I want to know about your perception on the development. You did from more pastoral conditions for your study. But I would like to know about the uncertainty from the perspective of water, right? In the Himalaya, what we try to see Shiva, as you mentioned, that the future uncertainty. This all are respected very deeply in development practice, and our core mythology are also there. But as we see that, try to see things from the water lens, and there are just last week, couple of weeks back, we had very big disaster happened in our land in the western part of Nepal, and it is beyond that monsoon season that used to happen in the past. So there are debates always, as you mentioned, that bad development, climate change are both meeting at the same point. There are certain confusions here. Which way of development we try to propose in the days ahead, whether that kind of events should be taken as a real thing, or there are something beyond something exceptional things that can happen, but not the kind of regular events. So these are some of the confusion we have talking about. So your thought would be great for this. Thank you.
Okay, let's get one more question. Two more questions. Yeah, back there. Just introduce yourself, okay? So I know Navina, so I really introduced him, since he takes over from me. But
no problem, Yogi. Thank you very much. My name is Suresh Chakka. I am a student of anthropology, working with the Department of Anthropology in TU. First of all, thank you very much. It was very interesting presentations, and it feels like I was in one of the graduate classrooms listening to the lecture. And then my quick remarks is like, for example, uncertainty has become definitely a kind of a central question now. But I mean, there has always been uncertainties, right? For example, if we see let's say the cases of the last 8 decades of the world and of Nepal as a case, I mean, you may call every decade as the decades of uncertainties. So. And then, for example, managing the uncertainties in the real time is definitely a kind of solution or strategies, but that is not the kind of permanent solutions to all the problems the development industry has imposed. That's one kind of small remarks. And the second, for example, you were kind of criticizing the Truman's statements or this Roscoe's anti-communist manifesto, the stages of growth. But you didn't actually spell out about this critique, like neo-Marxist critique of all those development models or modernization models, right? So I also would like to know your kind of ideas about this neo-Marxist, development models, and because that I want to know, like, whether the kind of solutions they proposed, like delinking the societies, is it still a kind of viable model for this kind of development that we are thinking of as a solutions? And my questions actually is basically one. That is, you actually see the pastoralist model as case to learn from, right? But in the whole discourses, you missed a concept of the state. For example, in Nepal, I was in Manang, Upper Manang, just a couple of years ago, and then I could see still the customary institutions and practices there are so noble, and they know how to manage all these resources. They have their kind of calendars of agriculture and pastoralist movement, right? But the question is, for example, probably Nepal is the only country where you have the one-fourth of the whole landscape is national park or conservation area. And then in addition to that, you have community forestries. And again, adding to that, you have different kind of institutions initiated by the state government and the local government. So that means these kind of initiatives or this kind of state policies not only have ruptured the the kind of pastoralist systems, which was very much, let's say, compatible to the given ecology conditions. But now they have completely destroyed this kind of pastoralist systems. So how do you see, these kind of, let's say, my question is, where is this step there in your whole, solutions that you are trying to foresee? Thank you very much.
Okay, one more and then we get to, yeah, please, back there.
Namaste, my name is Bola and I am a mathematical physicist. My question for Ian is the following. The notion of uncertainty emanates from the mind. In your models of uncertainty, do you consider the mind to be a blank slate?
That is deep.
Right. There was more than 3 questions in that one. Anyway. Let me, where shall I start? Let me start with the question of the exceptional and the regular. When does the exceptional become exceptional and not the regular? I think by framing things as exceptional and regular, we're still framing them as risk. If they're uncertain, we don't know what's going to happen, so we actually have to be continuously responsive. And very often we're not. So when something surprising happens, big landfall in Manasulu or whatever, then we're surprised. But we shouldn't be surprised, because it should be part and parcel of how we manage uncertainty continuously. So that's what I'm thinking about in terms of reliability professionals, is that whether they're in local government or whether they're in the Water Resources Bureau or whether they're in the Ministry of Agriculture, they've got to be ready for all of these. And with climate change and with changes in patterns of rainfall and so on and so forth, those skills are going to be more and more necessary. And my argument is that we often don't recognise those skills. They exist in these departments. Very often people are having to improvise and trying to make things up. They ring people up. What do we do? What should we do? And it's always at the last minute. But actually, if we recognise those skills more centrally, we train the engineers, we train the local government officials, we train the frontline humanitarian people in those skills, and then we'll be better able to deal with those irregular events, because irregular will be regular, if you see what I mean. Slight contradiction there, but that's what uncertainty is about. But, and this comes to the point that you were making in the back there, we can't always manage in this way. I mean, this sort of this improvisation, flexibility, adaptation, yes, these are important, but there are occasions, and I think this will become more and more apparent, when it's just impossible to do. So I don't want to get into the position of romanticizing the skills and practices of pastoralists beyond what they're capable of doing. If their land is removed by infrastructure development, if they're forcibly settled by government policies, if they've lost their pastures due to whatever change in natural resource conditions, then they're not going to be able to cope. And that's where I think that connecting this idea about uncertainty and knowledge about the future with more structural political economic understandings of how uncertainties are created or how vulnerabilities are created in particular settings is where the tradition of the neo-Marxist perspectives on vulnerability, thinking Michael Watts and people like that on geographies of vulnerability, becomes important, because vulnerabilities are constructed through political relations as well as knowledge relations. So I think it's a really important point you make, and it sort of pushes me back from an excessive idealization of the capacities of just being able to respond. But I think you need both. Because as the structural constraints affect people, whether that's pastoralists or bankers or control room operators or whatever, these reliability professional skills still are important. So we need both. We need the analysis of the structural constraints, but we also need a sense of the practical, what Paul Richards was talking about, the sort of practical knowledges that are out there. Bring those together. Your point, Deepak, about whether we can learn from the importance of mobilities to understand how livelihoods are changing in places like Nepal, I think is a really important one, because mobility is absolutely essential to maintaining pastoralism in highly marginal settings, whether it's montane settings or whether it's drylands, which I know better. Transhumance, movement between pastures, the whole point of living from uncertainty or living from variability is that animals must harvest protein and nutrients from different parts of the landscape. That's what people are doing. If you can't get your resources from your field of millet in the Kathmandu Valley, then somebody in your family must go to Doha and work. And that's why people's livelihood practices are increasingly dispersed, internationalized, across borders, across spaces. But in order to sustain mobility, you have to deal with questions that nation states find difficult to address, which are things like borders, visas, refugee rights, well not necessarily refugee migrant rights, and the ability to move. And the various compacts that exist around migration just simply aren't up to the job, because those compacts about human migration are often developed by so-called source destination countries. So in Europe, for example, who develops the migration rules for the European Union? It's the European Union. It's about preventing other people flooding into the European Union. Yet we need other people in the European Union. Well, Britain is not in the European Union anymore, but we need people even from Europe, let alone from elsewhere in the world. But yet we put up barriers, we put up fences, we put up restrictions. But with people moving, which is just very much part of our network society, and it's not just the elites like me and Deepak who dash to conferences in Berkeley and in New York and so on and so forth. It's other people who are seeking their livelihoods through movement we really need to take a lot of, really focus at. And I think, again, we can learn from how pastoralists are both constrained and how they enable movement, which is through social networks, about developing information systems that are sharing, through skills and knowledge that allow people to adapt their livelihoods in different settings, and from living from variability, very centrally. And I think migrants are very good at that. So we did a paper on this. It's in Comparative Migration Studies, I think is the name of the journal. It's open access. I can't remember its title. The lead author, or at least first author, is Natasha Maru. You can have a look at that, because we tried to engage with the migration people from the perspective of pastoral studies. Uncertainty and the mind. You challenged me here. Uncertainty is about knowledge. It's about how we understand the future. But the mind isn't a blank slate, because we're always constructing how futures are thought about through previous experiences. So it's Bayesian in that sense. I mean, we're continuing, if we're talking statistics, we're talking Bayesian statistics rather than standard normal statistics, where the experience of what's happened before affects our decisions hence. What's he called? George Shackle is an economist, British economist from the 1950s, I think. is very good on this, who describes how there are different forms of uncertainty depending on what's happened just before. And we're always making new decisions based on what we had before. So in that 2x2 matrix, of course, uncertainties are about, we don't know the likelihoods, but we know the outcomes. We know the possible outcomes. But our knowledge of those possible outcomes will affect our ability to think about the likelihoods, of course. So yes, we're not working on a blank slate, which is why when we divided those in the book, we divided those perspectives on uncertainty into those 5 different categories, which I rushed through in the presentation. Knowledge about the future is only one, but experience, emotion, affective connection with the world are other ones, and also our long-term practices of how we engage with the world affects what we do, necessarily. I don't think I've answered your question, but we can discuss afterwards. But it's a nice one, it's provoked me.
Okay, let's go for another round. Steve, 2 and 3. Okay, let's Steve.
I'm Stephen Biggs. I'm with SOAS at the moment. Thank you. I've got a couple of questions. One, it concerns how it is that the literature of the 60s and especially 70s in development studies had a lot of prominent anthropologists writing. And at the time, we saw the big development theory area. The big problem was how to get economists and anthropologists working together. And part of the discussions was the informal sector. And us who work on rural development issues, in a way, back in those days, as now, actually agriculture and rural economy, much of it is totally informal. It might be structured by some economists or others to create macro statistics, but if you just look how things are estimated, they don't tie up with any of the reality still of what's going on. And I would include pastoralists as part of that informal economy. But there was a whole literature coming up on informal research and development, where ideas come from, how those people interact with the state, whatever the state was, because there's never a situation where you don't have a state. So that was all very fertile. And one question is, how is it that development studies in a way has moved away or rediscovered what was actually a growing and well-recognized literature and areas? The second question is, people who haven't. In those days, we thought the big challenge was economists working with anthropologists. My own conclusion is social scientists working with engineers, or the problem of engineers. And that's why I hope Deepak will come in, because any of us who've worked in development studies where engineering, whether it's mechanical engineering, canal engineering, you see the evidence of where plans were put forward and approved, which were almost deterministic plans, and then the outcomes have always been so wildly different from what the engineers claimed would happen. But it appears within the engineering profession, there's very little reflexivity, which is then taught to students or the profession as a whole to take into account what actually ends up happening on the ground. it's almost as if what's happening on the ground never matters to engineers. So my question is, well, and my comment is, I think what we've missed out on as social scientists is working more or having inroads into engineering profession. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very wonderful session, I'd say. My question is a bit modest. Well, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Prince Ressa, and I research in areas of ecological economics. So I would like to know your perspective or your diagnosis on this statement that I've come across on this research paper that concerned uncertainty or disturbance as an integral part of socio-ecological systems. And the statement was that the risk management institutions, or specifically the crop insurance, it's pretty much related to agriculture. It is pretty much putting farmers into quite an uncomfortable zone where they do not have to worry about short-term uncertainties or disturbances like crop failures, and then incentivizes them to practice monocultural cash crops and leave behind indigenous, agricultures that are pretty much what is, pretty much part of the local climate system, let's say. And it kind of, the entire risk management system or the insurance system does not address slow and more impactful long-run uncertainties or disturbances such as soil erosions or disturbances or long-term disturbances in hydrogeological systems, groundwater systems and such. So there's some sort of discrepancy out here. So how do you analyze this statement in general? Thank you. That's all.
Hello everyone, I'm Prateeksha. I'm doing a PhD in social work. Thank you for that lecture, CVII. My question would be more like a broader sense. So what do you think about the challenges for rethinking development or decolonizing our thinking regarding development? Thank you.
Very good. Well, big and very good questions yet again. I mean, Steve, you've been around long enough to realise that in development studies, as in any other discipline or practice area, there is reinventions and rediscoveries of things that have existed before and get buried and come back again. But I think there was a loss of those insights that happened in the 70s in particular, around sort of indigenous knowledges, around informality, around practice-based approaches and so on. And it was associated with a wider trend, the growth of a sort of neoliberal, market-based form of development. The Washington Consensus steamrolled over a lot of other debates that were happening before that. I think the reclaiming of that is important, particularly because the Washington Consensus clearly failed. But now we're in a different era, so we don't want to reinvent the 1970s, but we need to, as it were, reclaim bits of those debates. I was reading a piece from Dudley Sears, who established, was a very brilliant economist who worked on trade and informal relations, who established our institute in the 1960s. So there's nothing new in the world, but I think some of those reinventions have to be located in the contemporary, which is why, in a slightly provocative way, I tried to link conventional debates about pastoralism and rural development with banking and the rest in the lecture. So I think it is a real challenge, and I think you're equally right that the challenge is not only one of connecting social anthropology with political economy or economics, which I think is still necessary, and perhaps even more necessary because the profession of economics in development has become narrower and narrower since those debates happened. The likes of Michael Lipton and so on, who are classic economists, were very broad-minded economists. in those days, relatively to many of the economists who have come since. Even if, at that time you probably disagreed with Michael. I'm sure you did, Steve. But connecting with engineering and natural sciences is a wholly different challenge. And one where, I studied biology. So I have a sort of sense of where, as it were, the sciences come from. I studied biology in Oxford. About as conventional science training as you can get in the world. And you studied engineering in Moscow, in Russia.
And I did agriculture.
And you did agriculture. So, we came out of those science disciplines with a particular mindset, and unraveling that mindset has taken time.
Our whole lifetime.
Basically, we're old now. We need to encourage it to happen a little bit quicker for the next generation, and encourage engineers who need to study, how to build a bridge, or I don't know what engineers do, but how to build a bridge, how to build a road, how to do, how to understand the physics of materials. All of that remains necessary. So it's not an anti-science position. It's saying, okay, what are practical skills that engineers dealing with materials or water or whatever need in addition? And I think those are ones where an engagement with social science becomes very useful, either in the same body or in collaborations. And that's the type of collaborations I seek personally when I do, and what the STEP Centre, for example, sought, when we do research together. So we would want to work with scientists and others. This question about disturbance in socio-ecological systems, that's a really interesting question. Because very often in this debate about risk versus uncertainty, we're actually only talking about short-run risks that are immediate. So it's a responsive, we assess the risk, we come up with a calculative measure, we design an insurance product or a social protection measure, and that's how we deal with it. But very often, exactly as you say, those measures unravel, not only because those risks aren't really risks, they're uncertainties, i.e. the calculations didn't work, and therefore the sort of actuarial assumptions that go into insurance don't work, but actually because long-run changes also undermine that. And I think climate change, where you have short-run and long-run climate change, substantial shifts in the global climatic system, and short-run effects, essentially of weather, are going to interact more and more. And actually, insurance and those type of products that are premised on risk actually don't do the job, either of the short run, for the reasons I explained, or indeed of the long run. And we have to reimagine what we have to do, how we have to understand complex systems. And that's why I think some of the literatures that come out of the socio-ecological systems literature around resilience, for example, I've got some critiques of that, but we don't have to go into that, can be quite generative in thinking about these things. So thank you for that. I think that was a useful comment. The final question was about decolonizing development. In a way, my whole argument was about decolonizing development. My argument was essentially that the framings of the way we think about the world have come from a particular tradition of Cartesian, Newtonian, Western thought. And they've affected the way we all think about the world. Not only in the West, but also in places like Nepal, where you've been infected by British colonial educational systems. And that's not just to say it's just a problem with the British. Soviet system equally had a form of thinking. It was different, but it had a form of thinking that resulted in particular versions of development, in that case coming out of a Leninist and Stalinist vision of how development should be done. I think uncertainty as a concept helps disturb some of that. I mean, there are many other concepts that help disturb some of that, but this is the one I'm offering to this session. Because uncertainty can be talked about so fluently by a Qinghai herder up in the mountains in the plateau in China, in a way that resonates with Hindu religion, and this Qinghai herder was a Buddhist, suggests that there are other systems of thought out there that aren't constrained by this particular version of Western thinking that we need to introduce into the lexicon of development and the education of next generations of people. That doesn't mean that we all have to become Buddhist or Hindus or whatever. It means that we need to draw from systems of thought that are not just the singular Western version. And that's what I see as decolonizing development. And I think, conversations like we're having here are ones that can foster that. So Deepak's example about Shiva, Vishnu and Brahma, I think was a nice example of how that disturbs a very particular version. So, yeah.
Okay, if there are more questions, Ajitji, and two, yeah. And then I'll have a final one that came on to me on email from someone who was going to be here.
Okay.
And then we'll close.
All right, okay.
Mike.
My name is Ajit Narayan Thapa. I'm basically a student of management, but dabble in politics and development. Very interesting presentation, thought-provoking. I was only wondering whether we completely, debunk conventional wisdom or the knowledge that we've acquired so far in terms of, forecasting risks, management and development, or do we say that this, in today's uncertain world, is not enough, that we need to go beyond this, not exactly debunk, but beyond this, add to this, right? To make whatever change is required as we go along. But some of that wisdom may be okay if we can, for instance, curtail down the uncertainties, bring more predictability, right? And but beyond all this, I think we need to do little global thinking, because for instance, we know, what causes climate change, more or less, it's known, right? But we are very slow to act. The world community has not acted in the way it has, and especially the West, and industrialized countries like China and India and all that are industrialized, they are not doing enough, although they know. Now, how do you go about, these are the things, like for instance, climate change has brought in immense unpredictability, be it floods in Pakistan and other places too, right? And wars. Have we predicted the Ukraine war? What has wars done? So how do you develop the global political mindset that looks at humanity at the globe level rather than their own nationalist thinking, right? I mean, how do you train a chap like Putin that that he's coming, making immense damage to the world community, right? And because, as you said, this is where probably conventional wisdom such as nationalism, I don't know whether it's a product of the West or even it's of the East, but it's hurting humanity. Even, for instance, advanced countries like America, they have done the simple thing of gun control. How do you change that mindset? I mean, everyone, it's so unpredictable. The children can't go to schools. Anybody could come and open up a machine gun. And they know what to do, but they still don't do it. So how do you change this mindset, of the leaders, of the policy makers? How do you do this? So another example is Burma. Nobody talks about burning Burma anymore, right? At one time it came to the limelight. Now it's been dwarfed by Pakistan, by Ukraine. It's Ukraine all over, right? So even knowing, what was required, we're not able to act in a way that that makes a situation where we can reduce uncertainties. I think the issue is, rather than coping with uncertainty, which is very difficult, if people have done it, we can learn from them. But the more important thing would be to reduce the uncertainties that are caused. And with that, I think we would do well to do a better job. But I'm sure. So I think it's a question of the knowledge that we've accumulated so far. I think we need to embrace whatever it is. We are good at a certain time. We are good at a certain conditions. But the conditions have changed. They are changing. They are not enough. So we need to do more, and even more at perhaps a global level. So that the global level activities affects every country in the world, right? Since we're interdependent. So although your message is very clear, we should not be narrow focused, right? We should not be restricted to a certain set of conditions and steps of operation, but look at a most holistic picture. I will agree with you. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for the talk. My name is Shauna Scoggin. I'm a PhD student in political science at Notre Dame. I'm here with the Fulbright, as some of you might be happy to know, as an affiliate with the Institute of Engineering. So they actually do require the master's students in disaster to do a semester of community research. So it's very interesting. They're really trying, I think, some places. So my question is, it's about legibility, especially since you had Scott spoke up there saying like the state. There's absolutely one dimension of legibility which is colonial, of things need to be legible to the state or to a colonial power in order to extract resources. I think there might also be another dimension of accountability. And I notice with the reliability workers, often there is like an inability of some sense to be fully legible because of the uncertainty. And so I'm thinking in terms of participatory, like it seems like it would be necessary for citizens to have some type of understanding of what is going on in order to assess things at the political level. And so I think there must be other mechanisms of legibility in these types of systems that you're looking at, and I wondered if you could speak to that. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to ask the last question here came on email from George Varghese. He's our social science Baha trustee member. He was going to come, judging from the emails I got over 3 or 4 emails from him about your talk. He did his PhD under Elinor Ostrom. And he had several emails, but I'm surprised. I think something must have happened and he couldn't come, but he was definitely going to. His question, and he's attached a note I forwarded to you to look at it over. His question was about, and you have touched on it, but it'd be good to expand slightly. This was on, uncertainty versus ambiguity. Okay? And his point was human agency interacting with uncertainty is more problematic than uncertainty itself. So that was where he was coming from. He would have probably framed his question much better, but somewhere along that, I think you touched it, but you might like to expand on that a bit. The other one, relates to what Steve and you've been asking about engineers, and I think one of the interesting things that happened just before COVID was the Oxford workshop we had with YASA and Steve Rayner's outfit in Oxford on how engineers think. And a book is coming out of that. Bruce Beck is working on it. He's been working on it for the last 3 years. It was just meant to be an article, and it got expanded in the process into a book. It's heavy on cultural theory, 4 types of engineering thinking, hierarchic, market individualistic and activist kind of thing, plus fatalist. And it's interesting that engineering thinking, again, like all scientists, depends, where you stand depends on where you sit. Where do you come from? What kind of a scientist are you? What kind of a media person are you? Are you an official Sarkari scientist or engineer or a media person? Are you an activist, investigative journalist, or are you an activist, egalitarian, Greenpeace type, journalist or scientist? And the questions you ask come from very different perspectives, okay? And what this brings to me, informal sector is one, but to me what was interesting was in this uncertainty thing, as engineers, when we start thinking, I think we haven't done enough to talk about, when stress shifts to insult. You have environmental stress, you have this stress, you have social and all that. Well, in Nepal, in November 20, we're going to have elections, and this is the biggest uncertainty in Nepal right now, because nobody knows. The politics has gone so fluid that there is not any chance of making any kind of sensible prediction. We don't know what's going to happen. So, when systems move from normal stress to insults that cannot be addressed and will be addressed by other means, whatever they may be, where do we go? Where does engineering go? Where does medicine go? And a whole lot of all these disciplines. So I'll end with that, and I think with your answer, we'll come to a close.
One question.
One more, okay, yeah, fine. Introduce yourself.
Thank you very much for this session, and this is my first time here to participate in this program. I'd like to thank the organizer of Social Science Baha, and I'd like to personally thank Scoones and Deepak sir. My question is very simple, not so big issue to present here, and this session has focused mostly on uncertainty and development, and I'd like to talk about the certainty. But in contrary, because this session has focused on uncertainty and development, but in contrary to this thought, future development of Nepal shall be conducted by existing prospects and in ideal conditions, because Nepal is a country with diversified caste and religions, with diversified cultural heritages, and in the context of Nepal, most of the youth, let me say technically, demographic dividend, bonus population, are moving towards foreign countries. If I say it is the state policy, but I need to raise the question here. And the preliminary report of Census 2021 shows that 20 lakh people, youth, young people, are absent from our country. So, regarding this, how do you address or how do you analyze this aspect in this session? Thank you.
Uncertainty to youth migration.
Okay, there were a lot of points there across the different interventions. Let me just touch on a few. I think you summed it up right. The idea is not to debunk everything. We have to draw from what already exists and go beyond. I agree with you entirely. And that often means making things more visible, and valorizing them, and making things that do work more acceptable. Because often they're not. The way that we cope and the way that we manage is often not, in your terms, legible. And that is because, if you use Jim Scott's arguments, that states see the world in a particular way, and that's, in his terms, this version of high modernism. And what he argues in Seeing Like a State and in many other books is that actually, if you look beyond that, there's a whole set of other practices that are ongoing that states don't see, or development agencies, or engineers, or experts, or, as it were, the accredited authorities with whom that development is constructed. And that's why, sort of bouncing off Jim's brilliant ways of expressing ideas, we talk about seeing like a pastoralist, which resonates with surfacing things that, again, that he's worked on in Southeast Asia and more recently including in Burma, in Myanmar, about forms of moral economy, social practices that exist, which are often hidden. They're part of networks. They're embedded in cultures. They're the things that people do on an everyday basis that aren't very legible, certainly to standard authorities. And that's why going beyond doesn't mean to say rejecting everything that existed before, but making certain practices much more legible in the way that we think about development. And that does require a more participatory, a more democratic, a more inclusive form of development that many people have argued for over the years. It also means, in terms of the comment that you made, thinking about this at a global level. And that is much more challenging, because the global mechanisms that exist around climate change, and we're about to have COP27 in Egypt, or biodiversity, we're about to have COP15 in Toronto, or the UN system, the Sustainable Development Goals, they are still trapped in that old version of the way we do things. Sustainable Development Goals, I don't know how many of them, I've forgotten, 17 goals, 267 indicators or something like this. It's very linear, very mechanistic, the way often the SDG UN process is interpreted. And that's because by default we end up with this, what do we have to deliver? We have to deliver on X, Y, and Z targets according to the Sustainable Development Goals, rather than thinking more laterally. So I think we've got a long way to go within the UN system, just as we have, whether it's with particular professions like engineers or national governments or whatever, to get these ideas through. And that will require more legibility, more participation, and more accountability within that. The question of ambiguity as distinct from uncertainty, ignorance, and risk, I tried to lay it out in Andy's diagram, which does it in relation to two axes. So ambiguity, to remind you, was where there's dispute, if you like, there's lack of firm knowledge about outcomes, even if the probabilities of those we know, or the likelihoods of each of those probabilities we know. And this was the case where there was, in the pastoral setting, a dispute between, not a dispute, a contestation, if you like, between camel rearing, wildlife conservation and tourism, and infrastructure development, all of which are possible outcomes. So to my mind, ambiguity in those terms is where we have to have a deliberation about what outcomes we want. And that necessarily means debating, talking about distribution, about equity, about justice, and about wider questions, in a way, of democracy and development. That's where ambiguity sits. It is a question about knowledge, but it's about contested knowledge about outcomes. And that, a lot of development is about contesting those. And that's where power, politics, and so on come in. So my case study in the diagram was Isiolo, northern Kenya. There's big money behind airport development, tourist development, conservation. Not a lot of big money and voice behind pastoral camel keeping. Although increasingly so, because there are markets for camel milk and so on and so forth. So it's a tussle. That's where ambiguity lies, to my mind. Your comments, Deepak, Oh no, those were your comments. Yeah. Relaying what George was asking. And then the final comment was about migration and uncertainty. There's often a narrative that says, oh, because the youth are going away from rural settings and going to work in the Gulf or elsewhere in the region, that's necessarily a bad thing. But actually those strategies may be a response to uncertainty in the locales from where they come. Why do people go to Doha? I mean, I'll give you an anecdote from my trek. So we had some porters, because I'm carrying stuff. So one of the porters was going to go and work in Doha after the trek to cook during the World Cup. Why? So we asked him why. Oh, so what are you doing? Oh, he's got a farm. Well, who's going to look after the farm? Well, his son's going to look after the farm, and his wife. He's going to go to Doha. He's going to earn some money. But what are you going to do with that money? Oh, I'm going to invest it back in the farm. It's circular migration, so it's not necessarily permanent migration. He was in his 30s. He's in his 30s. He probably wouldn't get a job later in life. I mean, Deepak applied to be a cook in Doha. They turned him down. But you know, it's a circular migration, so it's not necessarily a bad thing. I work a lot in southern Africa. Circular migration is very much part of the economies of southern Africa and has been for 150 years now. So I think Nepal is confronting a shift in the way that livelihoods are composed, which are not just about moving between the village and town, but between the village and places around the world. If the investment does come back, and Ganesha buys goats, as he was saying he would do, he would be sustaining a pastoral livelihood in Gurkha. So I think there's a lot of negative narratives about youth migration, but actually, given the way the world works, it actually makes a lot of sense. The challenges are ones that we talked about before. The difficulty, he was talking about, well, I'm not sure whether I'm going to get a 3-month visa or a 1-month visa or a 4-year visa, or whether I'll get it in time for the World Cup when the jobs are there. Those were his challenges, which were constraining his opportunities for migration. But I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but I think we should think about how multi-local, multi-plural livelihoods are constructed, and we all do that, all of us. My livelihood is constructed in a multi-local, plural way. Why shouldn't the pastoralist who lives in the mountains construct their livelihood in a multi-local, plural way, just as the elites have done for a long time? Anyway, I'm not sure that answered, but we can chat informally afterwards, and thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ian. I have one last responsibility, that is on behalf of Social Science Baha. We present our speakers with something. Yes.
What's inside?
Well, it's a cup, but it's designed in such a way that you really don't drink coffee from it, simply because it's got your name embossed in it, and you'd probably like to keep it on your desk rather than in your kitchen.
Thank you very much. Oh, wow.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all.
I will look after that. Thank you.